Arrived at the concluding session of the Digital Services Act Week. It's often said, but we really do have a packed program for you today. We've finally arrived at the concluding session of the Digital Services packed program today. So I'll be brief before passing the floor to Paul Adamson, Forum Europe's chairman, who will moderate today's session. It's been a week of vibrant debate on such an important file, and I particularly appreciated the extent to which all of the stakeholders have been open and shown a willingness to publicly scrutinize, exchange and interrogate ideas, and that has been the case across the board and across the sessions. We've also had a great deal of audience participation through the chat feature, but also through the Have Your Say sessions. And we've had hundreds of people participating across the week, and I'd like to put on record my thanks to everyone that has been involved. Our event partners at DEMA, ITI, and AIM, the European Brands Association, the long list of experts, the engagement from the European Commission, and you, our audience, for making this week as productive as it has been. A reminder that we will be publishing a brief report and a highlights package in the coming days. The hashtag for the conference is DSA Conf, and that you can, as in previous days, use the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen to pose your questions and your comments. You can find full details on Forum Europe's activities and virtual, and we hope at some point, physical EU policy debates and event solutions at www.forum-europe.com. And you can also reach out to myself or any members of the team through the platform today if you have any questions, comments, feedback, praise. Always nice to receive praise. And on that latter point, I'd like to once again thank my fantastic colleagues at Forum Europe, who I'm proud to work alongside, particularly in these different times, let's put it, and in particular to David Kirby, who's worked so hard to bring this DSA week together. So I think you've heard enough from me for 1 week, so I'll pass the floor now to Paul, and we're really looking forward to today's discussion. So thank you very much once again, and over to you, Paul.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to this final part of our week-long conference devoted to the Digital Services Act. We have had, as James was hinting, well over 600 registrations. So clearly this is a topic of key importance to all the stakeholders. And if you have been following and taking part in the sessions earlier this week, I hope that you have found them interesting and informative. And in passing, I must commend your enthusiasm and your stamina. For this concluding session, we will hear a keynote address from Margrethe Vestager, Executive Vice President of the European Commission, charged with the task of making Europe fit for the digital age. After her address, we will immediately move on to a mammoth panel discussion where we will try to draw together the discussions from the previous sessions earlier this week. Panelists will also be able to give their immediate reaction to the Executive Vice President's keynote. Time is pressing, so enough from me. A personal thank you to you, if I may, Margrethe, for agreeing to give this address. I have some idea of the enormous demands on your time, so on behalf of all my colleagues at Forum Europe, I'm most grateful that you could be with us today. Thank you. Over to you.
Well, I'm the one who's happy to be with you, if only virtually. But it is indeed a very, very impressive and important event because stakeholders from all sides of the debate have been participating, members of the European Parliament, from the business community, and I think the business community from a range of different sectors. Well-known academics have given their contribution, and of course, representatives of consumers and civil society. And it is indeed important because this is not just a technical debate. This is not just about how should we tweak one definition, how should we push a little bit here. This is basically a debate about what kind of internet do we want to have. It is that fundamental. And this is why everyone must be involved. This is why, even though I think everyone has a sense of urgency, it is still very important to have the time to listen well to different stakeholders. And this is why I'm so grateful for what you have done for these days in order to give that input. Obviously, 20 years ago when the e-commerce directive was adopted, it was a completely different digital world. I think back then, you would have to look very carefully if you were to find someone who would spend 2 hours on average per day on a social media platform. Also because social media platforms hardly existed at the time. We did not collectively download almost 400,000 apps every single minute. And we certainly did not enter like 3.8 million queries per minute on Google alone. And these are the statistics from before the coronavirus hit us. Because what happened, of course, is that we've just been seeing a surge in all kinds of digital activities. Because we have been working remotely, learning, socializing, some even exercising digitally. And that, of course, is new. Because 20 years ago, it didn't exist. The e-commerce directive does not provide answers to today's questions. It needs to be revised, and I think you share with me sort of this sense of urgency. In February this year, we set out our objectives as how to shape Europe's digital future, how to make sure that technology serves humans and that we push for the use of technology to have a purpose. And that purpose, of course, should be to enrich our lives, to improve our lives, and to make sure that the benefits are for all of us and not just for the chosen few. Some of the questions here where the crisis, at least in Europe, is at a very different phase. People ask me, well, now when we have had this very good use of digital technologies, have you changed your mind? Were you too critical of tech companies or too risk averse when it comes to digital technologies? And my answer to that question is just a flat no. On the contrary, I think it's more important than ever that we push forward with what we want to achieve. Because the more we use digital technology, the more important, obviously, it is that it reflects our values, our beliefs, the rules that we set up, because we have a decade and decade and decade of tradition of our democracy framing the marketplace in order to have a social market economy. And e-commerce, that allows us to buy and sell when most physical shops around us, they are closed. But also it allows those who want to manipulate us and to do illegal activities. We see a surge of that as well. Only 2 weeks ago, a UK study analyzed, or it came forward, they had analyzed 200 toys bought from the largest online marketplaces. Almost 60%, 6 out of 10 toys were illegal to sell in the EU because they failed to comply with safety requirements. And this is unacceptable. Any consumer who enters a shop on Main Street would, of course, expect that the toys are perfectly safe. We wouldn't think twice about whether or not the rules were fulfilled. We would not expect to see a fake leather bag in one of the stores on the same street. And that, of course, is what is needed also when shopping online, that we can trust the people with whom we shop, that the products are safe, and that there are no counterfeits. The thing we also have witnessed was an avalanche of disinformation. Disinformation that led people to ignore official health advice, and even engage in very risky behavior. Targeted disinformation campaigns were set out to undermine our democracy. And all of that erodes the trust in digital technologies, a trust that we need if we are to take that technology fully on board and to make the full use, and for everyone to engage in making the best of those technologies. And policymakers are not alone in thinking that the way in which a few digital companies dominating the internet requires a rebooting of our digital policy. Many internet users are getting more and more concerned that they have been transformed into sort of permanent data donors. And true, of course, we get a useful service in return, but we have no visibility of what is happening with our data once we have clicked away terms and conditions that separate us from the content that we wish to see. So the question here is, what will it take both to restore but also to build an increasing trust in our digital world? At high level, I would argue that we have to oblige digital companies to act more responsibly and with greater transparency. And we need more fairness in our markets. And to get there, it's not enough to design new rules. It's not enough to pass new rules with our co-legislators. We also need to be able to enforce it. The algorithm used in online marketplaces, well, they are the matchmakers of today's world. They connect sellers and buyers, and they cut out many of the traditional distribution chains. At the same time, this has reduced the possibility to enforce our laws. Custom authorities can only expect a fraction of the 2 million parcels that Chinese traders ship to European consumers every month. Market surveillance authorities are struggling to cope with such volumes too. So digital platforms need to assume greater responsibility for their activities. They benefit from commissions paid by the users and from the advertising income generated. It's only fair that they are also taking part of mitigating the risk arising to society. And this also matters from a level playing field perspective. European traders, they have to meet the product standards, they have to pay their taxes, and they are in direct competition with imports from rogue traders that do not do any of this. Abiding by the law should not lead anyone to a competitive disadvantage. So what to do about it? For a start, platforms used, well, they need to be better at identifying those who are selling on their marketplaces. It is ridiculous that a trader that has been caught selling illegal products can disappear like in thin air and sign up under a different name just a few minutes later. And platforms also need to act much more rigorously against illegal products and services offered on their platforms. And they have to cooperate more closely with law enforcement authorities so that the authors behind such criminal activity can actually be caught. When we are saying that we need more effective action against criminal content, we are equally determined to make sure that perfectly legal content is not removed accidentally. And this is very important when it comes to decisions that may affect fundamental rights or freedom of expression. At the moment, only the platforms themselves know what type of content is removed and on what grounds. We need transparency. We need accountability for these decisions. Users need to be informed when the content is removed and to be able to challenge this. Public authorities need to be able to supervise the activities of platforms with democratic values that are at stake, such as the integrity of our election processes. Such a modernized set of rules, they will also bring, I think, much needed legal certainty to businesses doing businesses in this way. And I think it's particularly important to smaller businesses, to startups, because very large platforms can always resort to an army of lawyers to address legal uncertainty and fragmentation. That is not necessarily a choice for the smaller business or the business just starting up. And those small businesses, they also need a fully functioning single market. Our strategic objective with the twin transitions of green and digital, well, that requires a single market that allows innovative companies to scale up. However, we have seen national laws trying to close the apparent gap left by the outdated e-commerce directive. These laws would usually serve a legitimate purpose, but they also do fragment our market. So to restore the single market, we need common rules. And we need better cooperation between national authorities in order to enforce these rules. And of course, greater clarity about the sharing of responsibility between the country where the service provider is established and the country where the activities actually do take place. And we also need fair competition in that unfragmented single market. If anyone, any company comes up with a better, more innovative product, well, it should be able to compete with the incumbent on equal terms, based on the merits of the offer, affordable prices, quality, the services, the innovativeness of their products. And this is not always the case in our digital economy. We have a small number of gatekeepers, gatekeeper platforms who act as private rules makers for the markets that they now basically own. And they decide who can enter their market, who can leave it, and what conditions are to be respected when selling on those markets. And now we have, I think it's next Sunday, the platform to business regulation will come into force. And it will partially address these measures. But it will not fundamentally solve the problem that some large platforms, they offer their own services on the markets they have created in direct competition with third-party sellers that depends on it. And one could say, well, does it matter if we have a private rule setter? No, not if the rules are set for fair competition. But I know, not from one, not from two, but from 3 Google cases, from the first Amazon case, from the cases that we have just opened. Of course, we will investigate those without prejudice, but from the cases decided that it's not necessarily the case. And this is why the Digital Services Act will also have to set limits as to what platforms can and cannot do, limiting the ways in which dominant companies may engage in behavior, and in particular, of course, rule out anti-competitive behavior. But that may not be sufficient either. But it will be, the best step forward that we say, you may be a gatekeeper, but these are the responsibilities that you have in the way you do business. And these are the do's and they do nots in how you do business. But the second thing is that due to network effects and the ability to draw on an everlasting pool of data, large platforms can easily transfer their competitive advantage into any neighboring market. And like a spider in the World Wide Web, they see everything that is going on. And they collect vital data that others cannot get. And this can lead to a tipping of markets that are currently still contestable, to create another gatekeeper in just another market. So we are also consulting on a new competition tool, a tool that will allow us to investigate the very market, to prevent that from tipping, to prevent a new gatekeeping function. Because the structure of the market in itself can create problems for competition, and we need more power to do something about that, more than what we can do with the individual casework. It is for us to do this. And this is why the debates in these days are so important, because we have choices to make. The Digital Services Act and the new competition tool, they are two important initiatives to define Europe's vision of a digital transformation that works for all. The public consultation is still running until the beginning of September. I really do hope that as many of you as possible will use your voice and participate. Of course, it's not the full picture. We have issues when it comes to democracy and a number of other things, but the Digital Services Act and the new competition tools, they are part of the essentials needed in order to make sure that technology serves humans and the market serves the consumer also when it's digital. Thank you very much, and I hope it will be a wonderful and intriguing debate.
Well, thank you so much. Before you disappear, Margrethe, just say thank you so much again for making the time. Your intent and commitment are pretty clear, and a rousing call to everybody out there who wants to make their own contribution to the debate to do so before the end of the consultation. Thank you again very much, Margrethe.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, moving rapidly on, because we have this mega panel to assemble. It's going to be a very great pleasure now to call on virtually the following 8 speakers to join my panel. Daniel Brown, Deputy Head of Cabinet for Commissioner Vera Jourova, who's Vice President, of course, for Values and Transparency at the European Commission. Prabhat Agarwal is Acting Head of Unit of E-Commerce and Platforms at DG Connect, the European Commission. Alex Ajus Saliba, who's Rapporteur for the DSA initiative at the IMCO Committee, the Internal Market Consumer Committee of the European Parliament. Miguel Polares Maduro, who is Professor at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence. Siada El Ramli, who's Director General of EDIMA. Michelle Gibbons, who's the Director General of AIM, the European Brands Association. Jason Oxman, President and CEO of ITIC. And last but not least, Frederick Donk, who's a Regional Vice President for Europe of the Internet Society. Now, each speaker will have some minutes to say their piece, and they can either react to Commissioner Vestager's comments just now, or if they spoke earlier in the week, if they want to fine-tune and hone one of their messages and reinforce it, or if they didn't speak, of course, earlier, is it their opportunity to reach their audiences. And then when at the end of each person's presentation, I will engage in a discussion with all 8 of you. And then we'll try and field as many of the questions that will come through, I'm sure, on the chat function as part of the debate going forward. So since time is pressing and we have about an hour and 20 minutes or so to solve all the world's problems in the DSA field, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to invite Daniel to open up the discussion. Over to you, Daniel.
So, can you hear me? I managed to unmute on Friday afternoon. That's good. And thank you for having me, and thank you for putting me under so much pressure by calling it a mega panel and stressing the time limitations. But let me maybe pick up on 2 things that Vice President Vestager just mentioned. And the first thing was the reference at the end to democracy and disinformation. And indeed, one thing is illegal content, but there is this broader perspective in looking at the rules for the digital space, that besides protecting the single market, safeguarding users' security and rights, there is the need to look at the democratic system itself. Historically, internet should have brought more democracy and interactions, but now it feels more like social media are amplifying harmful content and dividing. That's what we hear a lot. And democracy is about finding common answers, and also about citizens being able to form judgments and make their choices free from manipulation. So in this context, I'm mentioning this because we are launching the work on the European Democracy Action Plan that will build on 3 pillars: election integrity, media freedom and pluralism, and disinformation. And within this, we will address also issues related to platforms' responsibility and accountability, complementing more concretely the principles of the DSA, and see what we need in areas like data access for research, transparency of paid political content, or some specifics for election period. And we will be launching a public consultation soon, so sorry for your summer. And feeding into this will be the assessment of the code of practice on disinformation, and also the experience on disinformation specifically with COVID-19, which was an interesting test case, but a specific one in a way, because there were relatively clear authorities to refer to for verified health information. And when it comes to political opinions, this is much more complex, obviously, and it's more about plurality of opinions, which is why we also have to support media and civil society, which can help bring this plurality. And we are supporting the European Digital Media Observatory to help and link the actors and to increase the resilience, but you will have speakers after me. Professor Maduro speak about this, I believe, so I can skip that. And the second thing I wanted to mention is this trust and responsibility. What makes the regulation in this area, especially social media, so difficult is that you can't dissociate the best and the worst in it. And the internet and platforms can be enablers of democratic participation and information flows, and social media can be one of the safe ways to freely express opinions, even though there may be in some countries difficult conditions. So that's why we also need to have in mind this when we talk about editorial responsibility and not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I see our role in facilitating for the society to converge towards a solution or on where to draw this line. And I think Europe has good instincts to do this, to improve the integrity of the online space, which in turn will help make the society more resilient, which is the angle I wanted to bring in. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. On the point of information, can you tell us when this consultation will be launched before the summer and its closing date? Can you tell us that yet?
Depending on how efficient our DG translation is, it should be around the 15th of July, and it would run until mid-September.
Okay, well, thank you. As you said, it'll get in the way of our summer holidays, that's for sure. Thank you very much. We'll come back to a broader discussion at the end, as I said. Prabhat, over to you, Prabhat.
Thank you, Paul. I hope you can hear me okay. Good. I think the Commission has been speaking a lot, and after kind of illustrious speakers, Executive Vice President and Daniel from Vice President Jourova's cabinet, I don't want to stand in the way of a discussion, which I think the most important part of this. I just have 3 points that I'd just like to say. I think that one thing which has made me very optimistic and kind of also kind of encouraged me on taking on the responsibility here for leading the team that's preparing the options and designing the actual draft is that over the last months of talking to all sides of the debate, there's been an enormous convergence on the high level objectives of what we're trying to achieve, to keep users safe on the internet, make sure that the single market works better, particularly as we're taking out a huge loan on the back of the single market's future competitiveness now to repay the future debt on the coronavirus, you know, and to frame also somehow the responsibility and the accountability of some of these very important platforms in a way that is neither overshoots nor lets them off the hook. So I have to say that this has been an enormous convergence amongst the chorus of voices, and if you only read the media, I think it kind of belies the actual agreement that we have in the union on some of these high level objectives. So that was really my first observation. I think that the second observation, I think that is just basically also a thanks to you, Paul, and to the team, you know, just to say that, I mean, we've had a really enormously open and rich exchange with stakeholders, you know, and people have been, you know, open to share early ideas much earlier than in a normal co-legislative process, and have been brainstorming from all sides. You know, the amount of, it's not only the quantity of contributions we've received. I mean, you will have seen that even the roadmap, the two roadmaps combined have received 200 contributions. We've already received more than 200 preliminary contributions to the public consultation. We've had many meetings with stakeholders, and of course, in parallel, the Parliament has been very, very active in debating many of these issues. You know, but I just want to say that you know, thanks to everybody, including you, Paul, and your team, you know, for kind of having facilitated such an open dialogue. That's the second point that I wanted to say, and I hope very much that this continues as we go along. The third point is really one of a kind of a shaping step that we have to take now. As in the next months now, looking also closely to what the Parliament is debating and discussing, and also the views of the stakeholders, you know, we'll be taking on, we'll be presenting some options and designing some options for future political decision-making. Just one thing I want to just leave the panel and the audience with is that no major decisions have been taken on any of the outstanding decisions, outstanding issues, you know. So apart from the general principles that were already alluded to by Executive Vice President Vestager and Commissioner Breton in previous interventions, you know, keeping the broad architectural principles of the e-commerce directive in place, I think many of the detailed questions on scope for gatekeeper platforms, on defining parameters, you know, they will be shaped in the next months, and they will take into account what the stakeholders have been saying. So we want to continue to work openly and diligently on the preparation of the options for future decision making. So I just want to avoid the impression that everything that I have a kind of a draft here, you know, like the and that everything is a kind of you know, done and dusted already. So those are really my three main points I wanted to give in this after the very rich interventions already from Executive Vice President and from Daniel.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Prabhat, and thank you for your kind words. I'd like to now move on to Alex Ajus-Saliba. Alex, since you haven't been speaking in the conference this week, it'd be really good if you could spend a few seconds of your precious speaking time giving us an overview of what's happening in the European Parliament. As Prabhat just hinted, the Parliament has been very active, but maybe give us an idea of just how active so far. Over to you.
So first of all, Paul, thanks for this opportunity. Thanks to you and to Forum Europe. Yes, it's been a very busy couple of weeks within the Internal Market Committee. Right now, we're during a very politically sensitive period, since at this point we are discussing with all political groupings in the European Parliament the draft report on the legislative initiative on the DSA in the Internal Market Committee. We have 919 amendments that have been submitted from different members of the Internal Market Committee. Apart from that, we have another 4 committees who have an opinion on this report. So it's really active. Right now, we're having a lot of political negotiations at political level and at technical level, but things are going really well. Next Monday, we're going to have another political shadows meeting to also reach agreement on the last few political questions on the annex part of the report, but things are really going well within the European Parliament. Our report focuses mainly as an internal market committee because there are other 2 reports being undertaken by 2 other committees, the LIBE committee and the URI committee, but our report is focusing mainly on 2 important pillars. First of all, the revision of the e-commerce directive, and also the second part is the ex-ante rules. I was very happy today to hear Commissioner Executive Vice President Vestager tackling some of the most important questions that we are also tackling in our report, especially the fundamental principle, which is a guiding principle under our report, which is that of what is illegal offline should be considered illegal online, a high level of consumer protection, which are basically the 2 guiding principles in our report. Here we are dealing, as the EVP said, with a 20-year-old directive. There are a lot of elements which are still relevant, the fundamental pillars of the e-commerce directive, the internal market clause, the prohibition of the imposition of general monitoring under Article 15, the exemption of liability for illegal content. These should be preserved and safeguarded in the DSA package. But on the other hand, there are new realities that have developed during the past years that were not envisaged originally by the legislator 20 years ago, that needs to be tackled. And the Commissioner specifically mentioned the importance of trusts for users and consumers. And to gain trust for users and consumers, it is really important to have, first of all, a high level of consumer protection, user safety, and broad respect for fundamental European rights. And these principles, the principle of transparency, for example, in our report, is heavily felt in the provisions dealing with online advertisement, in the provisions dealing with algorithms, and also in the provisions dealing with added responsibilities that must be shouldered by those players falling under the definition of systemic. There we are also stressing upon the importance of transparency. I come again to the question of online marketplaces. In our report, we have dedicated a whole chapter dealing with online marketplaces so that we do away with examples, for example, that the EVP has already stated in her introductory and in her keynote speech. For example, the EVP mentioned the toys example. There are hundreds of other examples of issues, for example, cosmetics, counterfeited products, which is really important, first of all, to implement a fine line and implement the principle of having a more contestable environment online and having more responsibilities to be undertaken by third country sellers, basically, who are targeting directly EU consumers, who are targeting directly the EU market. So there we have a big legal loophole, which under the online marketplaces provisions, we are trying to close down so that we put more responsibility for third country sellers, more responsibility than also for online marketplaces when items, content has been already flagged and there is no representative, no third country seller representative in the EU market, then some kind of responsibility must be shouldered so that consumers are protected there. Another principle mentioned by the Executive Vice President was also dealing with the principle of anonymity in business-customer relationships online. And this is also one of the most important provisions that we are moving forward under our report, the Know Your Business Customer provisions. There was a lot of discussion also being undertaken at political level on the verification elements that we are going to use, but this is really an important principle so that there is more accountability, again, more transparency, and this will definitely lead, and again, I link with the executive vice president to boost trust of users and consumers. And I'm going to conclude on this point. We have a golden opportunity now. Some of the problems that have been there in the online ecosystem were felt for a number of years. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, due to the higher reliance that our users and consumers had on e-commerce, some of these problems were more prevalent, were more visible. Therefore, we have a golden opportunity right now to be ambitious with this DSA package and try with this revision, with having, for example, a better framework, for example, when it comes to notice and action. This is also another part that we have dedicated in our report, to have a more harmonized system, so that we have more clarity, more certainty for users and also for consumers. And as I said, we have a good opportunity to get things right and also set a good precedent, as what happened with the GDPR. We have an opportunity not to shape up the ecosystem, the online ecosystem for the EU, but we have an opportunity also to extend these principles globally. Therefore, basically, we will be protecting also EU public values with this package. Therefore, I am looking forward for a discussion also on these points, because as I said, the commissioner, the EVP Commissioner Vestager, has mentioned many important points, many important aspects that we are totally in line to be dealt when it comes to the DSA package.
Thank you very much, Alex. When it comes to discussion, I'll press you more about some of the timing of these deliberations inside the European Parliament and the hundreds of amendments that you're processing and how you go around processing that. It'll be an interesting discussion when we come to it in a few minutes' time. I now turn to Miguel. Professor, it's over to you. I see, Miguel, yesterday that your observatory announced the composition of your executive and advisory board. So we look forward to hearing from you with great interest. Miguel, over to you.
Indeed, thank you very much. And thank you very much for this opportunity to also present a bit the new European Digital Media Observatory. The way this panel is actually taking place is representative of how COVID-19, how the pandemic has made of the digital space even more our public space. The digital space, the internet, was already substantially impacting on our lives. But if until now it seemed to be reshaping our public sphere, maybe we can now say that it has actually become our public sphere. This shift makes sharper, inevitable, the question of trust on those that dominate that public space, the question that Vice President Vestager referred to, and also a variety of questions linked to that regarding the governance of the internet, its relation with democracy, free speech, and the public sphere. I would say that crucial among them is disinformation and its impact on democracy, both from the point of view of manipulation and from the point of view of polarization of the political space, both impacts to which Daniel has already referred. This question of disinformation, of distortion of information, of fake news is not a new problem, but it is one that the digital space has complicated and rendered more acute. It is so because it amplifies it, while at the same time reducing the role of traditional gatekeepers such as journalists. Information has often now become confused with knowledge. People tend to believe that because they have access to information, they have knowledge, and that is not necessarily so. And in fact, this leads to growing this confusion of access to information, of the ease of access to information with being knowledgeable about the facts and about all those issues, has led to growing challenges to those traditional trusted sources of authoritative knowledge, what I used to call the editors of our public space. Yet at the same time, and this is the paradox, the distribution of information on the internet is nevertheless highly curated. Social media platforms control the distribution of information. They do not do so, however, in order to ensure the veracity of information, but to maximize the engagement of the public. That is their main and priority. Information on social media platforms is also dispersed according to mechanical algorithms that power bots, indices, and search engines, whose accountability, again, and this has already been mentioning too, is ambiguous, if not disputed in many instances. I think the question, therefore, that we have is how should we engage and address this entirely new architecture of information and this new public space that is emerging. And the role of the European Digital Media Observatory, that brings together a variety of partners with the support of the European Commission, but being independent from the European Commission, is to mobilize and promote cooperation among all the different stakeholders in Europe that address this challenge and can help tackle this information. The objectives of the European Digital Media Observatory are those, in the first instance, the observatory will not itself be engaged in fact-checking, in control of information, or regulation even of online platforms. Instead, it wants to promote, to facilitate, to further the role played by a variety of stakeholders that are already engaged in tackling disinformation in Europe. It will do so by supporting and facilitating coordination of independent fact-checkers in Europe, including through the mapping of fact-checking activities and the creation of searchable directors, aggregating fact checks that already have been done, and media literacy material from external sources. It would also support and facilitate the coordination of academic research activities on disinformation. Also in this respect, we'll be creating a repository with relevant peer-reviewed scientific literature in this field. And it will also be engaged in providing support to public authorities in the monitoring of the policies put in place by online platforms to limit the spread and the impact of disinformation. It is with all this in view that the observatory will set up a secure online platform supporting academic analysis of disinformation campaigns, but also an open platform that is aimed and open to the general public, and that will promote and raise awareness about this information. In order to do so, the observatory is supported by an independent governance body. The purpose of this body is to ensure public trust on the work that the platform and also in providing support for negotiating and agreeing a framework that will help provide easier and more extended access, particularly to researchers and fact checkers, to the data of online platforms, that it is a priority recognized by all. This governance body is composed by an executive board and an advisory board. The executive board mostly composed by the partner institutions of the project. The advisory board composed of representatives of different stakeholders in the field of digital media, fact-checking organizations, traditional media, research, and academia. As I said, just to acknowledge that the observatory is hosted by the European University Institute together with other partners, but it is also supported and funded in its initial years by the European Commission. I think this is as a start and as a presentation of the observatory. I hope that this will be useful.
Thank you very much, Miguel. As I say, we'll come back in the discussion about what your ambitions are, not just your objectives, but your ambitions the observatory can hope to achieve in the weeks and months and years to come. It's now my pleasure to pass the floor to Siada. Siada, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for inviting me to speak as well. One thing I would like to point out for those of you who might not know EDIMA. EDIMA is the European Trade Association representing leading internet companies. And so we have actually proactively with our membership been deliberating the issue of content moderation for a while now, which meant that earlier this year we could also put some of our initial thoughts out into the world to discuss about content moderation, what needs to happen, and very much looking forward to creating a more robust framework, or at least working towards a more robust framework in which content moderation can be done. We call it the responsibility framework. So the reason I'm naming it is because responsibilities is at the heart of it. And we believe that that should be our end goal. Creating an online environment where responsibility is a key factor, is a building block for what we're doing. And by the online world, we're not just talking about the platforms, but the stakeholders as a whole, all involved in content distribution. And why is that of relevance? Through experience in recent years, we've seen that just being one part of the stakeholder chain trying to address the issue, regardless of the size of the entities or the impact of a service, there will be gaps. We've seen that on the terrorist content piece and trying to tackle terrorist content. We've seen it in disinformation, where when there is good collaboration with other stakeholders, measures are much more effective. We've seen it on different, just to name a few, but we've seen it on different accounts. We heard the executive vice president talking about pushing forward. We believe exactly the same. We need to push forward, but to do that, we need to have a good basis to push forward on. So we have the e-commerce directive. There are areas that need addressing, but there are also very strong pillars and principles of the e-commerce directive that are very much still valid. That has also been echoed by a number of the speakers on this panel. And we think that we should try and see how to bolster those more. So in our framework, we're talking about trying to be pragmatic, allowing for action to be taken to address current issues in the most pragmatic manner. This not being done in a void, but having an oversight to make sure that they're effective, that they meet the objectives that we have, be that from a democracy standpoint, be it from an IPR standpoint, that we actually tackle those issues at hand. And so that would be by an independent governance body. But very important as well is to have the legal certainty. And that's one area that we really need to, from our perspective, we have a lot of gaps. We need the legal certainty to know how we can operate within which content, context, sorry. So if you think of it, for example, notice and action, right at the heart of content moderation, we need to have more clarity as to what the process actually entails to whom. Who needs to do what? It's complex. It's an intertwined set of obligations and rights of all of the different stakeholders. And how do you bring that to the forefront of facilitating better content moderation? So that's working towards our objective of having better quality content moderation at the end. And then, of course, last but not least, jurisprudence, which is an area that we all need to have to as an underground to the full framework. I think what I would like to talk about as well is and I'll leave you with this point, which is the DSA could mean so much to so many. And I don't even want to start thinking about the task at hand for the Commission services right now in trying to pull what I'm sure will be a lot of input they're going to get from the stakeholders. But I think that for us to be able to be effective, and us meaning all of us interested in strengthening Europe's digital policymaking and environment, we need to focus. That doesn't mean that the end point of what we see roll out as initial initiatives under the DSA is necessarily where we will end, but we should start where we have legal certainty. To be concrete, illegal content is maybe the easiest area to start with because there are definitions in place, and then go further where the political aspirations are as well, and where there is a need to address issues, but as more definitions become available. So I'm going to leave you here with this just a minor introduction and happy to answer any questions. Looking forward to the debate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ziada. We'll come back to the discussion. Everybody will have a more bites of the cherry, I promise you. Over to you, Michelle. I hope you're there.
Yes, thanks, Paul. And thanks to everyone on the panel so far. It's been very interesting points. I'd like to echo what the Executive Vice President was talking about in terms of building trust, responsibility, and protecting innovation as well in the digital economy. Trust is the anchor for a successful digital economy going forward. And we believe that it's extremely important to ensure that trust by protecting consumers from illegal goods. AIM is the European Brands Association. I represent branded goods manufacturers. And what we want to see with the Digital Services Act, we see this as the opportunity to create a framework which will enable that consumer trust to be restored, as she said, and rebuilt even more strongly than before. A fair and level playing field, of course, is a very important part of that as well. And we see that as an equal parameter for the DSA. In terms of illegal goods, and she referenced it, she referenced a number of different examples. Counterfeit is a growing problem in Europe. We see a growth of 35% in the last 3 years that have been analysed. And this is something that we feel has to be tackled, has to be addressed now, and can be with the Digital Services Act. And actually, as Ziada just said, that can provide the framework to tackle some of these issues and address them together. We have 4 key points. We see that there should be a minimum set of rules that would enable this a trusted environment, digital environment. We see that there should be legal obligations as opposed to the current self-assessment voluntary approach, which we don't believe is working, as I just said, in terms of the growth of counterfeit illegal goods online. Alex mentioned the know your customer principle, very important for us. We believe that that is another part of this, that the verification of the identity of sellers is a very important part of this going forward. Platforms have no obligations to verify the identity of sellers. And we believe that this problem, this leads to a challenge in terms of how you trace liability for if they're a customer, a consumer, or a business, there has been business harm. So this is something we should see that should also be addressed. And I think I could echo what Alex has said in terms of, this is a golden opportunity in terms of setting the right framework and putting that right framework in place for the European digital economy to lead as well at a global level. Be proactive and transparent. Be proactive in terms of stopping the illegal goods from getting online in the first place, and be transparent in terms of what has been removed and the measures that are taken, because we have very little visibility on what we see on that. And actually the Executive Vice President talked about visibility in another context, but we see this as important as well going forward. And actually, Saida, I agree, the notice and takedown procedure in the context of illegal goods, yeah, that needs to be clear as well. We believe there should be a clear harmonized framework in Europe that everyone is abiding by and can follow and implement and execute without problems. And the fourth point for us, and this is an extremely important point in building that consumer trust and restoring that trust, is to ensure that consumers know if they have bought something that is illegal. Tell them. Once it's found that it is illegal, whether it is found by the platform or found by brands, let's make sure that consumers know about that. The Executive Vice President mentioned, toys, and I think Alex mentioned, cosmetics, medicine. Everything is counterfeited. We make it, they fake it. Everything is counterfeited, and it is important that we let consumers know, tell them that if they have something that is illegal, that they've bought unwittingly, unknowingly, stop using it, so that because it is an important piece of information to get to them, to give to them. So in conclusion, we feel that there's a genuine opportunity with the Digital Services Act, and can only echo what both the Executive Vice President has mentioned, and also Alex has mentioned in terms of the work going on in the European Parliament, that this is an opportunity to have a fair and equitable system and to protect Europe's consumers. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much, Michelle. We have to move rapidly on. So without further ado, Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. And congratulations, Paul, to you and the Forum Europe team for a phenomenal event. Important discussions taking place, very interesting speakers, and delighted to be a part of this important virtual event. ITI is the global voice of the technology industry. Our member companies include leading innovative European companies and companies around the world doing business in Europe. Our Brussels office has been very busy providing collaborative input into these important rulemaking legislative proceedings, and we will continue to do so. The technology industry recognizes that we have a shared responsibility, and that responsibility is to maintain a safe, inclusive, and innovative online environment. We support the goals of the Digital Services Act to safeguard citizens from harmful and illegal content online, and equally importantly, to maintain a well-functioning and competitive online ecosystem to the benefit of consumers. Our industry is aware there are new challenges that we face, that our societies face in the online era. Disinformation online, we've heard about being a big challenge, counterfeit goods being a big challenge, safety and security. But it's important to remember that the technology industry is focused on bringing products and services that benefit citizens globally. You know, we heard, I think very thoughtfully from Executive Vice President Vestager about what we are focused on, and that is, what kind of internet do we want to have? What are we focused on? We're focused on technology products and services that enrich and improve our lives. That's what we need to be focused on when we decide the right public policies to adopt to encourage this competitive online marketplace. So I think it's important to think about what the Digital Services Act could accomplish. It's going to address the responsibilities of businesses online, but we need to think about the complex online ecosystem and all the other companies in that ecosystem that are impacted. It's not just large players. It's crucial that we preserve the core principles of the internet itself, such as the limited liability regime and the country of origin principle that are well established by the e-commerce directive. Those have been vital to the internet's success. But we also need to rethink the way that illegal content is handled, and that should be the focus of the DSA. For example, we need effective notice and takedown mechanisms. Today, platforms face a dilemma when screening content on their sites. They may remove crucial liability protections if they take too much action. That's not the way we want this to go. This is a dilemma that can be fixed. Useful in this context would be to harmonize the definitions of illegal content at the EU level. Illegal content should be the focus. Harmful content can be addressed separately through self or co-regulatory approaches. At the same time, there is enormous value in exploring a single EU-wide coordinated oversight mechanism to enhance legal certainty. You've heard a lot about the importance of certainty and the importance of enforcement. It's important to remember that the technology industry shares the goal of pursuing criminals. All of the illegal behavior, whether it's counterfeit goods, disinformation, or otherwise, it's harmful and it's perpetrated by criminals, not by technology companies. A single coordinated EU-wide oversight mechanism would not interfere with the responsibilities of national courts. It could provide guidance to consumers and to technology companies and help identify sensible enforcement measures. These enforcement measures should include basic default criteria for notice and action systems. It should include the kind of KYC systems that Michelle was talking about. These are critical to address illegal content and counterfeit goods. And finally, boosting enforcement capabilities for national authorities is another crucial step toward addressing many of the problems we currently face, including in particular the proliferation of counterfeit goods. So with our thanks to the Forum Europe for this enormously important event, and with our commitment that the technology industry is focused on making the kind of internet we want to have a positive one that enriches and improves all of our lives, we look forward to further discussion.
Thank you, Jason. Before I hand over to our final speaker, Frederick, just to remind all of the hundreds of you out there watching and listening, start thinking about any questions you may want to put to the panel via the chat function. If you don't have any ideas, because it's late on Friday now, it's been a long week, don't worry, because I'm sure the panel will have lots to talk about, and I certainly have lots of questions, but I always defer to the chat function as a matter of principle. Final speaker, Frederick, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Paul. And I will also join my appreciations and thanks to you and your team for this excellent week we spent together. I've been impressed by all what I heard so far. I see a good consistency. So I guess Prabhat, Daniel, and even Alex, this consultation is done, right? I mean, we've done all the job. No, more seriously, those who have heard me earlier this week heard me speaking about the internet way of networking. Sounds like a pretty techie word, but actually it's not. It's just about the way the internet operates, and this is how it explains internet success. We see this as the critical property. So I won't walk you through this one by one. I will come back in a few minutes about that. I would like to say a few words about internet intermediary liabilities. The focus seems to be clearly those days on platforms, the Twitter and the Facebook of this world. But by internet intermediaries, you got a whole lot of other actors at the infrastructure layer. And those are the CDN, the IXP, the ISP, the registries, the registrars of this world. They all have a job to do there. So while the tendency seems to be to discuss those days about, and for various reasons, competition, encryption, disinformation, hate speech, there is an attempt to revisiting intermediaries' responsibility. So again, as I said, it might just target platforms, but it does target and impact the infrastructure layers as well. I got many examples that I could share about regulation or court injunctions asking or requiring some of those actors to block content in some countries, including in Europe, using IP blocking, deep packet inspection, DNS blocking, and so on. This has an impact on the internet health. This has an impact on the critical internet system as we know it. It has an impact on the integrity, the security, the performance, and the speed of the internet. So we would like to make that very clear. So we would like to, whenever we discuss regulation, including on intermediary, to put on our lenses of the internet way of networking. So let me give you two concrete examples. One of the most critical and important property of the internet is the layer architectures and interoperable and reusable building blocks of the internet. I believe the important one is layer architecture. So as you know, the internet is just made by different layers. It starts with the wires, with just the network itself. And when you go up, you go to the transport, including TCP/IP, and then the application, the service layers up the stack there. So whenever you, and this is what intermediary liability is based on, you got different layers with different responsibility. This is what we're talking about. Someone at the lower layer is doing their own job in their own layer, and others doing their own job at another layer. So this is the separation, I would say, of responsibilities. And this is what intermediary liability is doing, actually, to recognize that infrastructure providers should stay away or considered away from the content that they're hosting or that they just transport. The second property is the decentralized management and distribute routing. So internet just is the network of network. And this is the word internet, actually. It's composed of almost 70,000 autonomous systems that actually voluntarily collaborate and decide to pass on different packets along their networks. So they are independent and they take decisions in a very independent way on how they will route traffic. And it's based off their own business models, their own local requirement, on everything they might decide to do. Again, here, reducing liability of those network providers might just have an impact on the way they might decide to route and do their own business, and it will have an impact on the performance and security of the internet. So all to say, and I will finish on this one, I believe internet and intermediary liability was meaningful in a way that it just gave the internet all the reason to just be the success that we know those days. So we understand that there are a lot of discussions going on right now about the responsibility of the different players, but we feel that we should keep this internet with networking lenses to assess which impact it will have on the internet itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frederic. Well, that's the end of the opening remarks by our panel. I see some questions starting to come in, but before I turn to the chat part of this debate, let me throw some questions out to the panel. And again, starting with Margrethe's keynote an hour ago now. She did say, and it's a question anybody can answer, but many of you want to respond to, this question of gatekeepers. She said there's a small number of gatekeeper platforms who set all the rules. And Prabhat, not today, but 3 days ago, he referenced that also in his intervention at that panel discussion on competition. He did say that his boss wants to look more closely at gatekeepers. I sense in her remarks that she didn't seem quite sure how to go about it, but maybe I'm misinterpreting her remarks. So anybody in the panel would like to respond to her remarks, the remark that gatekeeper platforms have to be addressed. They're the elephant in the room. They are there. It's reality, and we have to do something about it. Who wants to respond?
If I may.
Yeah, Jason.
Thanks very much. I thought that was a very interesting point that she made too, and it does raise the question, as you suggested, what exactly is a gatekeeper? The roadmap refers to certain platforms as having become or acting as gatekeepers, but it doesn't say what exactly the consumer harm is from a gatekeeper. And our advice, and we submitted this in our comments to the Commission, we should not single out companies based exclusively on their size. And the reason you don't do that is because it's not clear how that would alleviate any concerns in the marketplace. And B, it actually discourages growth. In the current pandemic, one of the reasons we're able to use great technology to work from home, to learn from home, is because companies of a particular size can deploy products and services that benefit all consumers. If we exercise authority against gatekeepers based exclusively on their size, you actually deter companies from getting big. And big is not bad. It, in some cases, is good. And we shouldn't use this gatekeeper definition. We should focus on actual marketplace harms.
Anybody want to take should we say, a contrasting view to Jason's? Prabhat, are you still with us?
If I may.
Yes. Do you want to respond?
I'm happy to go first. Well, I think that, first of all, I think Paul, Executive Vice President Vestager, has a rather clear idea of what she wants. And if it didn't come across, clearly, then I think that at least her guidance to us is unambiguous. So I don't think that there's any room for misunderstanding. I think what Jason is right to say is to point out that this needs to be filled now on the basis of evidence and analysis, and this is this is very much what we're doing. I wish to point out that this is an area where we have extensive questions in the public consultation. We're looking for input. Just one thing that I said it also. I think I said it also in the previous panel. And I just want to reiterate, this is not a notion that kind of falls from the sky, that in DG Connect has kind of come up with gatekeeper platforms. I mean, in the various competition-related reports, there are all sorts of similar notions, whether it's strategic market power, bottleneck power, systemic power. So this is not a, this is not a kind of a lone, isolated concept that we have, kind of invented. And what we are doing at the moment, and we're not the only ones who are doing it, is that we're synthesizing the different parameters that have been put on the table in various reports, international reports, and expert analysis, and we have our own analysis going on in parallel, being done internally to identify what exactly are we speaking about. I think that the difference is we're not only talking about size, just to comment on the issue whether we're not penalizing anybody for size, but there are two aspects here. One is that we always look at size of companies when we discuss issues of proportionality. That's a rule, is a kind of mandatory requirement under better regulation, is for us to assess whether the burden that incurs, or the behavioral effect that incurs from a given intervention can be borne by all actors who are targeted in the same way. So size is certainly a parameter that we need to look at in terms of proportionality tests as well. The final thing I would say is that we are very much also, open to discussing consumer harms and issues that arise. But we are also conscious of the fact that there is a big wide community out there that has been saying that we need to take a broader look at these kind of network effects that are unique, perhaps, in the data-driven economy. So I'll just leave it there, but just those are some elements of reflections that are feeding into our analysis.
Thank you, Prabhat. Anybody else want to come in before I move on? Alex.
So I think that I'm totally in favor, and this is also reflected in our report, to tackle with an ex-ante regulation. It's really important because we are seeing users being logged in. We are seeing developing online an environment which is not competitive. It's not competitive for SMEs, for startups. And this is leading for a problem when it comes also to consumer choice. It's leading to a problem when it comes to innovation. So we believe that the ex posto type of competition, traditional competition regulation is not fit for the new realities that are developing in the online ecosystem. When it comes to defining systemic platform, I think this is one of the biggest questions. And in our report, we also tried to define, and we made it totally clear that it will not be just, and it will not do justice if we focus only on the size and on the number of users. So we proposed a number of elements, enjoying, for example, a significant market position, playing a systemic role in the online economy, and the indicators. And we proposed also a number of indicators, for example, the predominant influence on users, the presence of network effects, barriers of entry, financial strength, the ability to access data, and also the accumulation of data, and also another element, vertical integration, and its role to be also an unavoidable partner. These are all ideas that we are discussing and that are on the table, and are also reflective of a number of amendments that have been moved forward in this regard. But the idea, and I think that the way forward, is not to use one strict measurement for defining who has a systemic role and who has not, but to have a set of indicators pointing in the direction of having a systemic user. But I believe, again, and I reiterate this point, that it is of fundamental importance that we have ex-ante regulation so that we have more contestable markets, more user choice.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody else want to come in on that? I can't. Nobody else? Okay. I have a question here from the chat function. Let's go backwards and forwards to the chat and then back to the panel. From Frederick de Baca, who does regulation at Telefonica, addressed to you, Miguel. How platforms' insistence on preserving the quote-unquote no general monitoring obligation, can that be squared with the fact that online content is anyway already highly curated by platforms?
It can't. It can't be square. That's precisely the point. They are already curating the algorithms they develop. What I have put in place in a lot of extent already selects the information that we see. which information is priority to us. They have lots of instruments to profile information. So the question becomes, what form of regulation or self-regulation should address the issues that if you want, the editorial role that the online platforms already play themselves with regard to information requires. I think that we need to recognize that they do play an editorial role. And so the question becomes, how do we address that? Having said this, I think it's too easy to put only the blame on online platforms in this respect. They are charged both with doing too little and allowing a lot of fake news to be disseminated and spread and have a higher impact than otherwise it might have. But they're also charged often with doing too much, or then with interfering with free speech. And that's the difficulty. It's a classic difficulty that we've had in our traditional public sphere on how to deal with free speech, but that is now presenting itself in a totally new way, because it's taking place not only in a different environment, in a different public sphere that is digital, that has a different rhythm and a different scale, but is also often now regulated through private entities and not public entities. So I think part of it will pass by forms of self-regulation, by forms of transparency. The code of conduct developed in that respect is an important step forward. But in other part, it's important to reinforce how citizens themselves behave in the digital space, to increase their media literacy, their digital literacy, and to make them more resilient to be able to distinguish what is disinformation from what is truth, and to identify other forms even of misinformation. So I think we need to operate in the different levels, but a lot of it's still unknown. We are regulating, we are intervening on a space that is new. It is a classic problem, but that it presents to us in a totally different way, and that's a good part of the challenge that we face. In the same way as the previous discussion was also highlighting regarding how do we apply competition rules in this new environment.
Thank you. Thank you. To Daniel, I know Siada, before I give you the floor, I noticed yesterday you said in the previous session that you said, I'm more or less quoting your words, let's focus on content moderation. Definitely, I think you said also today, just now, that we need to have a definition of harmful as opposed to illegal content. So do you want to maybe amplify that a bit more?
Definitely. So let me first start by, we've always said, and this goes back years, that we don't want to be judge and jury of the content that's allowed to be online. That's something that we have pleaded to get more guidance on, because obviously also with regards to our role and what the result could be in terms of being overly zealous in taking down content without well, not even without a valid reason, but without having the guidance on how to do that or what needs to be taken down, there will be ramifications towards our, with regards to our liability regime. So that's one thing that we have to bear in mind. We're currently being asked to do more continuously, yet that having the reassurances as to how to be able to do more, be that through technical means or policies, doesn't exist, which is why we say we need to have a possibility to act and also then be evaluated on whatever actions we take and have an oversight of the actions that the industry takes. But we need to have the possibility to do that without it straight away meaning in a loss of your limited liability, which is desperately needed to make the online ecosystem function. The difference between the illegality and harmful definitions therefore also comes into play very strongly, because where you have a clear definition of what constitutes illegal content, that means you have an obligation to act. With the harmful content, which is something that we're very engaged in, be it in disinformation by having our own code of practice, our industry code of practice that is being overseen by the European Commission, on disinformation, for example, and the reports that we're doing, et cetera, et cetera. These are all measures that we're taking to try and improve the situation, but without having the starting point of a legal definition or a trigger to act. And that's exactly why I said we need to have that backbone of the definitions, the backbone of the legislation to support a framework like I was putting forward.
Thank you, Siada. Daniel, if I may ask, is that, forgive my ignorance, is that something that you will address in the European Democracy Action Plan and the consultations? Is that one of the questions you're asking for input on? Daniel? Yeah.
Yes, I'm back unmuted. We do want to look at definition of disinformation in the European Democracy Action Plan. At the same time, two remarks and reactions to Siada maybe. One is, I think it's not our role to advise on how exactly to do the job, and I don't think the platforms actually need the help. It's our job to define through democratic process the harms to society and to single markets that we want the platforms to address, and create mechanisms that there can be oversight. And when we talk about disinformation, just to remind, it's not about content only. And certainly we don't want a ministry of truth, and we never called for removal of legal content. And I think that we need to be fair and say this is not only an issue indeed of the platforms, this is a societal issue. So what we were aiming at also in the recent communication on COVID disinformation was to enable the civil society, the public, to have scrutiny on what is happening online, what is the harmful content that users are engaging with, which we don't have in sufficient level now, and also to have scrutiny on the policies that the platforms are using. And we welcomed many of the steps, and I think the reaction to the COVID context has been excellent, and the platforms have introduced content moderation policies already, which again is rather easier for the health context, and they promoted authoritative content. But where we will need to go towards it is more transparency and scrutiny, not necessarily looking at content and defining what needs to be taken down, and empowering the other actors.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. There's a question from a lady called Verity Tennyson. I'm not sure where she's from. Is building on what you just said and what Siada just said, the previous question, and Miguel's answer as well. How might the DSA interact with existing provisions of the Democracy Action Plan, the AVMSD, the Audiovisual Services Directive, and various other codes of practice currently in operation? Do you want to have a stab at answering that? And anybody else in the panel want to come in afterwards?
Yeah, I can very briefly react. The code of practice we're assessing now, there have been some assessments done already by ERGA and independent evaluators. So we will do our own assessment soon, and that will feed into the European Democracy Action Plan elaboration. The interaction will need to be there. Indeed, it doesn't stand in isolation. The European Democracy Action Plan will not only address the platforms. I think that's an important angle to be taken into account. We are looking at resilience of democracies, and the frontline defenders for me are rather civil society and media, and these we need to empower, including by making the platforms more open and more helpful to them. Second remark, it will be a combination of legislative and non-legislative steps. So there will probably be legislation on financing of political parties, or maybe on political advertising, more specifically linked to the more general provisions of the DSA. And I think, again, we have to look at transparency and scrutiny, where we're having a monthly monitoring program now with the platforms on COVID disinformation, which I think will be a test case for what could be a soft law approach later. So I can imagine that the European Democracy Action Plan will specify the transparency requirements relating to disinformation, and maybe specify also the requirements for the other pillars I mentioned, like enforcement of rules for political campaigns and electoral periods.
Thank you, Dan. Anybody else want to come in before I move on to the next question? If you just raise your hand, maybe so I can see you. Nobody else? Okay. Oh, Siada. Yeah, briefly, Siada.
10 seconds. I think that's one of the things that we're going to see more and more of, the complexity of trying to have the DSA come in, hopefully, to provide us with that overall framework, and at the same time having to accommodate both existing legislation, build on self-regulation or co-regulation, whatever the case may be by that time, and the national initiatives at those levels as well. I think harmonizing that all into a European approach will make it very interesting. So I'll stop.
That's a euphemism, presumably, the word. Alex.
Maybe just one clarification, just to clarify something. Maybe it was a slip of the tongue of Professor Oxman when he referred to notice and action to notice and takedown, because this is one of the most important points for us. We were talking a lot about the importance of not going into the direction of over removal of illegal content. And we believe that a system of notice and takedown and notice and stay downs will definitely be directly obliging more digital service providers to take down content. And this will lead to a situation of over removal of content. Therefore, intentionally, we have always gone into the direction of notice and action. Just a small clarification, a small point that I wanted to.
Very important. Thank you, Alex. Okay, I'll move on to another question from the chat room, from a gentleman called Brian Antas, independent journalist. I have heard much about how the platforms need to improve, but could the panelists comment on what platforms are doing well and where they can build on this good work? That's a nice question to ask the entire panel. Who wants to jump in? Maybe not Siada first time, this Siada. Michelle, do you want to say something? You've been very quiet until now.
Yes, so in terms of, because we're very focused, of course, on the illegal goods side of this discussion, and what I see, and I think we have pretty much agreement across the panel about the need to actually address that and figure out ways how we can do that. So the DSA can provide the framework for that in terms of addressing illegal goods to protect consumers in Europe. In terms of what platforms have done well on that side, I mean, there are one of the challenges we have is some of the platforms have got some good systems in place in terms of some of these, of trying to take down some of these illegal goods, but we find it's very patchy. So this is why we're looking for some kind of clear, harmonized framework in terms of doing this. But I do believe there is a will there to ensure that these illegal goods do not proliferate further in Europe, but we do need to have some clear minimum rules in order to get that in place. So we've had some, we have some good experiences, but we have some experiences which are quite patchy as well. That's from the illegal goods side.
Okay. Anybody else want to respond to that question?
So
Dan, where are we? I've got to keep in mind all of you. I think it's who unmuted? Alex? Okay, Alex, you're unmuted.
So sometimes when we're discussing these principles of the DSA and what needs to be done, sometimes we seem to be a bit going into the direction of all doom and gloom, and it's not the case. So a lot of platforms are doing a lot to prevent and to help in creating safer environment, online environment, cleaner online environment from illegal content. So we are not going into the direction of saying that platforms are not doing anything, but at the same time, we cannot leave everything for self-regulation for codes of conduct. And we can do that for two important reasons. First of all, as the industry has been consistently saying, that it's really important for them to have more clarity, more certainty, and that is a fundamental point. So it goes also in the direction of being more helpful for the industry, but at the same time, there are also some loopholes, legal loopholes, and some important points that we need to address because self-regulation in that area has not properly worked. And in my introductory remarks, for example, I mentioned specifically online marketplaces and some of the biggest issues that we have, for example, with third country sellers, etc. So it's really important to maintain what is working. And even with the e-commerce directive, we're not saying that the e-commerce directive is totally useless today. There are a lot of elements of the e-commerce directive which are still very important to retain. But at the same time, there are new realities which self-regulation alone, and that's why it's really important for us not to go into the direction of a US system of a Good Samaritan approach. It is really important to tackle the issues that are not working and are not being tackled directly or sufficiently by self-regulation alone.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Did Daniel want to come in? Siada wants to come in, certainly. Siada.
Okay, so I know that we've got limited time, so I'll keep it short, but one of the things that's been going really well is, one of the things to bear in mind, is that we, for example, on the Code of Practice on Disinformation, if we look at where we started in 2018, there was nothing in place. It was the first of such a code of practice globally that was actually started. So all the improvements, all the lessons learned, including for the industry, what we've learned through the past 2 years, through the experience of the European elections, through the experience of working with the WHO and Ministries of Health on COVID-19, those are all building blocks to making the system more robust, also in self-regulation. But we would not claim that we have tackled and solved the issue of disinformation. With content moderation, it's an ongoing effort. And so we need to continue to be able to adapt and tweak what we can do as well to tackle it, to make it more efficient. So that's one thing. The other thing is we're very reliant, everything is interlinked. So we're not, I think I mentioned, we're not working in a void where we have better interaction with the other stakeholders. We can improve things much quicker and a lot better. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that self-regulation is ineffective, but we first of all need to have an opportunity to show how effective it is. So time, which we don't always have. Sometimes it's very much of a luxury, and we need to straight away start producing data. And the other thing is, remember that the end game is to continue to develop those mechanisms, not just claim that you have tackled it, because it's not something that you can just tackle. There is no end point as such.
Right. Daniel, did you want to come in or not?
Yes, very briefly, if I may. I would keep my time for the last question that came in now. So I will just say now that I agree pretty much with what Siada said, and the positive thing was that the platforms did engage and joined the code of practice, which is, by the way, not the case for many brands, which are also important in combating monetization, for example, of disinformation. So I don't want to preempt the assessment of the code of practice, but this is positive.
Okay. Well, since time is running out, we all realize that, and there's so much to talk about, which is very frustrating. It's also very gratifying, I suppose. Cedric, question from Cedric Suarez from INBE. I confess I do not know what INBE is, so Cedric, forgive me for not knowing. The question is, we hear a lot about European values and the need to ensure that non-EU based companies should respect these values, but are we clear on what these actually are? What are the values that we are referring to? Are we sure that existing EU companies are also following these values? Okay, that's a good one. Who wants to jump in there? Raise your hand. Frederick, yes, you haven't heard from you for a while. Frederick.
Yeah, thank you. Well, actually, I would like to link these questions to what I've seen before in the chat, and that, wait a second. There was a question about the extraterritoriality, which I believe fits quite well with this question. And I would like to take a stance on this one. Yes, I believe the DSA is a very ambitious plan. I like the fact that it relies on our European values, but you're right, others might share or have other values. All of this it's also supporting the idea that Europe might have a digital sovereignty. And that is the big elephant in the room, because everything we do in Europe will have an impact, extraterritorial impact, which might impact the internet itself, which is global by nature. So that is a bigger conversation that we might have. So even though we rely on good values, there are an impact, which, and I don't like to jump on this word all the time, which have or might have the consequence of fragment the internet.
Right. Well, you did say on Tuesday, I was paying attention, Frederick, that you see yourself as the honest brokers of the internet. So I'm sure you have a role to play. Miguel wants to. Miguel? Unmute Miguel.
I had actually raised my hand with regard to the previous question.
Oh, forgive me for being slow.
But I can also very quick answer to this one. I think there's a variety of European Union values that are consensual in Europe and recognized as such, from pluralism to free speech, to privacy, to consumer protection and consumer information. Those are all a set of values that I think are part both of the European Union as a community of law, but also as part of the internal market, and those are consensually. This doesn't mean that there are or not other values that can be contested and can be developed with time, and that the operation and the specification of these values with respect to digital space may require debates and generate controversies. But I think that the values themselves are rather clear. As to the previous question, I just wanted to raise the issue that I think it's an interesting development that we have seen on the part of online platforms, that has an increased concern with the fairness of their internal procedures deciding on content. We've seen these ideas of developing almost judicial procedures and almost judicial bodies, quasi-judicial bodies within this some of these big online platforms and social networks. I think it's an interesting development. It's one that we should look into hopefully, but we should also be clear that the fact that they will generate more legitimate internal procedures to decide on these issues should not exclude external accountability that will remain necessary, including on how these procedures will be put in place and will operate.
Yeah, well, actually, and on that one, I see there's a question from a lady called Nadia Guerlanda Cabral, advocacy consultant with Avaz. On harmful content, she says, could the panel comment on the difference between liability over third-party content and liability over processes, quote unquote, that would de-amplify and curb the spread of harmful content? Freedom of speech is not freedom of reach, right? That's a nice little phrase to finish off the question. Anybody want to respond to Nadia's question? Raise your virtual hand, please. Jason.
Thanks very much. And I think this goes to Alex's earlier point about the scope and the reach of what regulation would require. It's that notice and action idea. And the concern that we have expressed, and that I think is an important part of the debate, is who is the arbiter of speech? Do you want companies deciding what speech is good and what speech is bad and deciding what to put up and what to take down? Or do you want the government determining what speech is good and what speech is bad? I think neither of those is an ideal result. The answer to bad speech, I think, is more speech. So we want to ensure that companies aren't liable for trying to do the right thing. That's the idea behind liability protection. It's giving companies the authority to take down illegal content, to go after counterfeit goods, but not holding them responsible if they miss something. They're trying in good faith to do the right thing, but by deploying those tools, sometimes things get missed. And you don't want to hold them responsible for missing something, because then they won't deploy the tools in the first place. That's the concern that we have.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, briefly, because we're running out of time.
Yeah, well, this goes to the very core. I mean, people disclose information, and when it's legal, it's fine and protected. But a different matter is how it is distributed, and that's no longer a fundamental right, but it's largely business choice. So this freedom of reach, not freedom of speech, not freedom of reach, I think is the right phrase. And the way we're looking at it and is that we need to prepare a system that will allow people to better understand and manage the information flows that go to them, and to empower people to assess where it comes from, but also to allow the online space to public scrutiny and allow research into what's happening. So I think that's a very pertinent question and goes to the European Democracy Action Plan core. Thank you.
Anybody else want to intervene briefly? I have one last question for all of you that I would like to ask, but then before I do that, anybody on the panel, if you just raise your hand so I can see you. If not, I will just ask my Alex, quickly, very briefly.
Just very briefly. When we were talking about notice and action, and this is very clearly highlighted in our report, we were always saying it explicitly that we are restricting notice and action system only for illegal content. Again, and I must reiterate this point, when it comes to differentiating and targeting between illegal and harmful content, when trying to define illegal content, it is already very tricky. So you have 27 different legal systems, all defining differently what is illegal in the member state. So one of the things that is really important is, first of all, to focus and to have a definition under the DSA of what illegal content are we going to target our efforts upon. But I think that extending the notice and action system also to harmful content, again, will lead to more of a removal of legal content, especially, and I reiterate this point, if we use a notice and takedown system.
Thank you, Alex. I'm going to ask a final question to all of you, if I may, because we have to bring this to a close. What struck me today, but also the previous 3 days of our DSA marathon, in the discussions I was watching and listening to, again and again, we came back to the issue of definitions. Even Andreas Schwab a couple of days ago talked about how do we find a gatekeeper. Somebody else talked about the difference between responsibility and liability, and so on and so on and so on. And what seems to be supposed to be inevitable, I accept that. And Prabhat did reassure us he has nothing written down yet on what he wants to do, and his colleagues in the Commission when the consultation is over. And surely in the hundreds of amendments that Alex and his colleagues in the European Parliament are going to be sifting through and voting on as of now, there is this issue of definition. And I noticed, and I put you on the spot, Prabhat, I want you to answer this question first, and then I'll go one by one through the entire panel. You did say a couple of days ago, we should not be too afraid of definitional issues. Do you remember saying that? What did you mean by that? And then other people can pitch in.
Well, thanks, Paul. Just what I wanted to say is that we shouldn't be afraid of the fact that we today don't know exactly what parameters determine what a gatekeeper is. Doesn't mean in itself that it's impossible to define in a way that is reasonable and evidence-based on what a gatekeeper is. That's what I meant. I mean, it's always easy to ask a question, well, what do you mean exactly when you introduce a new concept? You know, because it's new, well, you don't know. I mean, it has to be filled with meaning. I think the important point is that the definitions meet some basic criteria: legal certainty, immediately understandable and verifiable, you know, that objectively verifiable. So those are kind of some parameters that any good definition means. When information society services as a definition was introduced in the e-commerce directive, I don't think people, I mean, I'm sure people have asked, what do you mean? What is an information society service? If you look back at the definition, you know, it's not trivial definition, you know, but we've come to live with it for 20 years and nobody questions it. It's the basis of judgments at the highest courts, you know, but so that's what I meant when I said we shouldn't be too scared. I mean, we're breaking some new ground here. It's going to come with some new concepts, you know, so we've got to take that step, you know, but it needs to be evidence-based and needs to make sense.
Thank you, Prabhat. Who wants to chip? I'll make sure everybody on the panel gets a chance to speak. Who wants to go in first? Miguel, over to you, sir. Unmute, please, Miguel.
Okay. Yes. And so I'm a lawyer, and lawyer love definitions. But in the realm of speech, I would say definitions are particularly important. If you want to, I would say that definitions need to be, when you're regulating speech, very clearly defined. And the reason is very easy to understand. So we should not be afraid of them. On the contrary, we need them. because if you don't have clear definitions, the risk is that you are empower those that will enforce those definitions with a large margin of discretion that can turn into arbitrary in the context of speech, and you want to avoid that. So I would say, certainly in the area of regulating speech in the internet and digital space, definitions are of crucial importance.
Thank you, Miguel. Who wants to go next? Everybody will get a chance to speak. Michelle.
Paul, thank you. So consumer protection is defined. Illegal goods are defined. Trademark law. Product standards are defined. So we have definitions that we can work with to ensure that illegal goods do not get onto the EU market, to Europe's consumers. So, the DSA can provide this framework to ensure that all operators, including platforms, know what to do in terms of making sure that those definitions are abided by, and illegal goods do not get onto the market. So we can work with this from the illegal goods perspective, definitely. That's there.
Thank you, Michelle. Who's next? We're going to take Frederic.
Okay, just on the definition side, you might be surprised, but I would be on Prabat's side. I mean, I'm myself more pragmatic. I've seen some literature from the UK in which they say, let's just develop this while we process all of this, and gosh, we will miss the Brits. I love this pragmatic approach. But what you will hear me is if whatever comes next is not future-proof, if it's not fit for purpose, and that is that it might hate the internet and the internet fundamentals. And this is why my community, the technical community, would just love to contribute to this with a technical impact assessment, meaning what it is that we do that might impact the fundamentals of the internet. So that's a proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederic. Who's next? Siada. Sorry, Siada.
Sorry, I was just unmuting. Yeah, so for us, definitions, I think I've mentioned it a few too many times to now come back to anything other than we're looking for more definition. But definitions are very important, and definitions in the broader sense of the word, not just to define the processes, but in the broader sense to understand how we can really work with the framework. To Michelle's point, what does that mean in terms of defining responsibilities, proportionality of services, not just thinking about the companies that are involved. And that's again to Frederic's point that it needs to be future-proof. So let's not just look at the business models on the market today, but let's look at what we're trying to achieve. And to do that, we need to have those definitions and enforcement to make it work. And I think that all goes hand in hand would be my
Thank you, Siada. Moving on, who's next? Alex.
So yes, I am also totally in favor of moving forward some definitions and trying to define some aspects. And this is important, and I take a different angle. There are, for example, some elements in the current e-commerce directive, for example, which are really important and fundamentally important for the liability shields under Article 12 to 14, for example, the passive and active status. We haven't delved into those issues today. And when we don't have clear definitions, we will be totally reliant on court jurisprudence. And if we are totally reliant on court jurisprudence, this will bring a lot of uncertainty and different judgments, which will bring a lot of confusion. And we have seen this very clearly when it comes to active and passive status. And therefore, it's really important when you have some important elements, they must and they should be defined to have more legal certainty.
Thank you, Alex. Jason.
Thank you. I think this definition issue is a perfect example of why collaboration between industry and policymakers is so important. I look, for example, at the Code of Practice on Disinformation as a great example. Founded a couple of years ago, brought together representatives from online platforms, social networks, stakeholders in the advertising industry even. It was the first group to agree on a code of practice to address online disinformation and fake news and counterfeit goods. And it could be a model worldwide. Indeed, Vice President Jourova recently noted that the tools developed in that code of practice were the basis for a fast and thoughtful response to new challenges posed by COVID-19. So I think that's a good example of how a public-private partnership can really take on these definitional issues and address them in an effective way.
Thank you, Jason. The final word to you, Daniel.
That sounds scary. Yeah, no, in the past, I worked on the code of conduct on illegal hate speech. And indeed, I see a huge difference coming back to the beginning between illegal hate speech and free speech. So it's perfectly right to make the requirements more legally sound. Doesn't mean that the code of conduct can't continue, because it created also a collaborative environment with the civil society and the platforms and the authorities. And that's important that it continues. On disinformation, zooming in on disinformation. I mean, there was so much support for definitions. I can't say that we were not going to address them. And there is a need to differentiate also in light of COVID between disinformation, misinformation caused by miseducation and not having the intention to do public harm, influence operations by foreign actors, etc. So we will look at that. On the other hand, let's look at the policy goal, that is to empower the whole society to better understand what is happening and to protect the citizens from manipulation and to allow them to make their own opinion free of manipulation through transparency requirements that we will have to define. So for me, that's the more important angle in a way. And since it's my last word, thank you very much.
Thank you. Your dernier mot. Thank you very much, Daniel. Well, that's a wrap. We have to bring this to an end. I was told by my colleagues before we started that I would be allowed to go over time a bit. And given the number of interventions and the questions from the chat function, I used a few more minutes. My apologies to anybody who asked a question via the chat function we didn't address, but maybe there are ways to make your voice heard in other ways. In this debate is not going away, that is for sure. My thanks to my mega panel. When I say mega, I don't just mean the quantity, I also mean the quality. It's been tremendous. I've learned a lot as usual, but you've made yourselves available. I appreciate that. All the speakers the previous days as well. Some of you came back for a repeat performance to show how masochistic you are, but also how very supportive you are to what we've been doing. And my thanks to all of you who thanked us, Forum Europe. I can take little credit. David Kirby and James Wilmot and other colleagues did, as usual, most of the heavy lifting. I just turned up on the day and moderated. Thank you all. We'll carry on the discussions, and good luck, all of you policymakers, in your ongoing work. And make sure you keep listening to the outside world. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.